with 1 in every 7 people on the move. Threats of nuclear war and the apparent inability or unwillingness of nations to settle differences peacefully. Shameful income and global wealth inequality, with 8 men owning as much as half of the world's population. And emerging worldwide anxieties and threats to peace driven by any number of the preceding. The history of our species shows that, notwithstanding the best technologies of their time, human civilization after human civilization collapsed. Dr. Diamandis tells the story of why aluminum disappeared soon after it was discovered more than 2,000 years ago. Though it resurfaced, its use became commonplace only with the invention of electrolysis in 1886. His takeaway is that aluminum was scarce only until a cheap and relatively inexpensive innovation came along to extract it from bauxite. Once again, technology had pushed back the frontiers of scarcity. However, there are a few other takeaways from this story, as told by Pliny the Elder in Book 35 in his Naturalis Historia. It's also about human greed, which technology does not solve. It's about how a powerful Roman emperor, Tiberius, sought to monopolize precious metals and control their value, and how the poor lost their livelihood once again, and even their lives, as in this case the poor man was beheaded. The tale is not unlike the way rich bankers are alleged to have fiddled with the LIBOR, or London Interbank Offered Rate, in the UK, when many mid-level bankers lost their livelihood. The moral, if there is one, is that, as the history of innovation shows, it is always the rich and powerful that benefit most, and the poor are considered prosperous because it takes only 6 months' earnings to be able to afford a prior generation iPhone, to Google the world's trove of knowledge, unaware that their privacy is being mined and sold to big tech, even as they connect on Facebook. Yes, that washes down well with stale, leftover coffee, doesn't it? What if there were an X Prize for better ways to govern to ensure economic fairness and even distribution of a country's resources? X Prize designs prizes in the domain areas of space, oceans, learning, health, energy, environment, transportation, safety, and robotics, and has awarded 17 last count. What if there were an X Prize to find ways to eliminate inequality? What if there were an X Prize to address the tensions in the Middle East? What if there were an X Prize to come up with solutions to the problems driving migrant crises worldwide? What if some of these super wealthy techno-sapiens were to use their money to address the inequalities and economic neglect that breed unrest and terrorism among minority populations? What if there were an X Prize to motivate Homo sapiens to solve its biggest problem? How to mature beyond the point of using all these brilliant innovations and technologies to destroy one another, Earth's species, habitats, and environments. Today, we can launch an intercontinental ballistic missile from a submerged submarine that could destroy an entire nation, ignite a global war, and probably end our species. By 2050, climate change will push European cities toward a breaking point. 1/3 of the world's crops depend on bees and other pollinators, and by 2050, bees might be among the first species we lose. By 2052, according to the World Bank, climate change could force more than 140 million people from their homes. And depending on the amount of climate-warming greenhouse gases are emitted during the next few decades, between 2047 and 2069 mean annual climate on Earth will slip past the most extreme conditions experienced in the past 150 years. Indeed, it is estimated that up to 5 billion people will face an entirely new climate. Now, who is working to find innovative solutions to these problems? Regrettably, inherent in each of our amazing innovations is the power to do good and the power to do evil, to build up and to tear down, to give life and to end it, to nurture and protect our species, or to drive it to extinction. And running through that brief period of history in which we accomplished all those marvelous things is a trail of death and destruction of other species, Earth's habitats, and members of our own species. In the slightly paraphrased words of Carl Sagan, we are an interesting species. We're capable of such beautiful dreams and such horrible nightmares. This seeming inability to stop our species from committing harikari underscores the fact that while our amazing ability to innovate has turbocharged the advance of our species and might yet turn out to be essential to our survival, it will never be sufficient by itself to ensure Homo sapiens' survival. It is this sad prospect that continues to cast deep doubts on any hope one might have for a technologically driven survival strategy, whether here on Earth or anywhere else in the galaxy. Cassius once said to Brutus, "The fault, dear Brutus, is not in our stars, but in ourselves." And indeed, the problem, dear techno-sapiens, is not in our ability to innovate, but in our inability to mature. Not in our technologies, but in us. It's precisely here that innovation is desperately needed and remains conspicuously lacking. Unlike any other species so far, Homo sapiens evolved the capabilities to change the outcome of nature, both for better and for worse. Some uses of this ability have been downright scary. The problem our species must confront is not an inability to innovate, but an unwillingness to mature past the point of self-extinction, addressed in a later chapter. However, those who continue to pin their hopes on our species' ability to adapt and innovate itself out of any existential threat using technology must accept that our ability to survive as a species will have to come from an entirely different quarter, an as yet poorly explored innate capability. It is a capability that evolution has planted deep within our species, along with our ability to adapt and innovate. It's the next in that set of survival patterns: adapt, innovate, mature, migrate, survive, or go extinct. We have been examining the requirement to mature and the freedom to choose survival over extinction. Almost like an inactive gene waiting to be turned on, Homo sapiens' ability to choose and reach for evolutionary maturity must be activated. But like the evolution of most things, Homo sapiens' innovations, like batteries, are not included, nor are they needed to access and use this ability. All that is needed is for Homo sapiens to prioritize survival of Earth's species, ecosystem, and themselves over extinction, choices we have so far been reluctant to make as a species, though less so as individuals. The real message in the emergence of AI and other existential threats is, perhaps, that our species is running out of time to make those choices. Long before Homo sapiens developed its ability to adapt and innovate, evolution had been busy doing some innovating of its own. Innovating a planet with sustainable, capable habitats that can last for billions of years, in order to ensure the evolution and sustainability of complex animal life and emergent intelligent species, like Homo sapiens. Like the ultimate long-term investor, billions of years ahead of everyone and everything else, evolution began preparing by plowing resources into the galaxy. First, it selected the right type of star that can last the billions of years it would take for life to go from slime to ape-man to spaceman, and then, hopefully, to evolutionary maturity. In short, it was a mineral-rich, rocky planet with a moon to stabilize its orbit, and with outer orbit planets to shield it from incoming threats. placed it in a stable orbit in the habitable zone of its star, supplied it with running water on its surface, and an oxygen-rich atmosphere with an ozone shield to block DNA-destroying UV and gamma rays, and provided a temperature range suitable for complex animal and human life. Some scientists think finding another planet with a significant fraction of these Earth attributes is unlikely. As if that were not enough, evolution went on to ensure that the chosen planet would have access to a perpetual and comparatively safe source of renewable energy, clean air, clean water, lots of organic, natural, renewable food sources, and natural habitats filled with renewable and recyclable materials that can be used and reused from one generation to another. Then it went on to populate it with a menagerie of species, enabling one, Homo sapiens, unlike all others, to evolve the ability to determine its own evolutionary destiny by choosing to avoid potential self-extinction, grow to evolutionary maturity, and go on to populate the stars, or choosing to go extinct, taking 4 billion years of evolution along with it. Sounds like a nice yarn, but most of the above has already occurred, except for the bits about extinction, or growing to evolutionary maturity and populating the stars. What a track record! One that even futurist Ray Kurzweil can envy. If I were a futurist or a big-time market investor like Warren Buffett, my money would be on the rest also happening. Which futurist are you betting on? But haven't you noticed? It is so easy to miss this most important of points. The focus of evolutionary innovation appears to have been on one thing and one thing only: species evolution and survival, including our own. Evolution's innovations targeted species survival. The motivation and drivers of evolutionary innovation were also exclusively species evolution and survival. And as such, evolution came from a place that elevated habitat sustainability and species survival above all else. The outcome evolution appears to be seeking is for emergent intelligent species, such as Homo sapiens, to avoid self-extinction, reach evolutionary maturity, and go on to populate the stars. Evolution seemed even willing to go all in and bet 4 billion years of evolution that a lone, emergent intelligent species, endowed with the freedom to choose its own destiny, would ultimately choose evolutionary maturity over self-extinction. However, like any smart investor, evolution appears to have a few moves left should things go south with Homo sapiens. With at least another 4 billion years left before Earth's warranty expires, evolution can start all over with another, hopefully more intelligent, species, should there be a Homo sapiens-induced global extinction. I seriously doubt any of our wiliest investors, given a similar choice, would have bet on Homo sapiens, as evolution appears to have done. Unlike evolutions, Homo sapiens innovations are ultimately driven by only one outcome: profits. Whereas evolution's innovations are motivated, driven, and directed to ensure habitat sustainability and species survival, Homo sapiens innovations are ultimately motivated, driven, and directed to ensure ever-increasing economic growth and a lopsided market share. Whereas evolution ultimately seeks species maturity and the avoidance of self-extinction, Homo sapiens are ultimately seeking to amass personal, corporate, and global wealth, economic growth, and, wherever possible, monopolistic control of scarce resources. And since we are willing to stop at nothing to attain these outcomes, even if that entails devastating Earth's habitats, heating its oceans, killing off its wildlife, and razing its forests. We are destroying any potential shot we might have at avoiding self-extinction and attaining evolutionary maturity. The contrast here couldn't be any starker. For evolution, drilling for fossil fuels for energy and pumping CO2 into the atmosphere would have been a non-starter. For evolution, polluting the atmosphere, heating the oceans, scarring the Earth in search of mineral resources and fossil fuels, and destroying habitats and the species they support in order to do so must be an anathema. For evolution, wantonly destroying one's own species, which evolution has gone to such lengths and cost to evolve and sustain, is probably enough to write Homo sapiens off and start all over again, if evolution's and Homo sapiens' roles were reversed. Yet the fact that our species is still around leads one to suspect there might be more to this galactic intrigue than meets the eye. It doesn't require evolutionary intelligence to have expected Homo sapiens to be an evolutionary accident waiting to happen. That such a potentially disastrous outcome was highly likely, if not inevitable. If the outcome had been so predictable, why, one might ask, would evolution evolve a species and essentially give it the keys to the planet, knowing that there was a high probability of it all ending in self-extinction? Why would evolution have turned species survival and habitat sustainability over to an alpha species like Homo sapiens, with no a priori guarantee of a successful outcome? Might it not be precisely because hominins are the only species, as far as is known, with whom evolution appears to have decided to share control of their evolutionary outcome, knowing that outcome can potentially bring an end to more than 4 billion years of evolution on Earth? That if successful, evolution will be jump-starting an even more exciting evolutionary phase, wherein, for the first time, evolution would be partnering with a species to chart the next phase of its evolutionary journey. What next phase, you're wondering? In Chapter 5, we called this new potential evolutionary phase species-driven evolution, and we wondered aloud whether species-driven evolution might not be a prerequisite for intelligent species survival and extraterrestrial intelligent species evolution. So, discussing each of these concepts in turn, let's look first at what species-driven evolution might mean. Can one have an intelligent species if it is unable to choose its own path and destiny? Clearly not, as it is this intelligence that makes it different from all other species not so endowed. Once one entertains the notion of an intelligent species that is able to go its own way, one whose brains are no longer stuck running the same instinctive base routines that execute and control the behaviors, responses, and outcomes of non-intelligent species, then one would expect this intelligent species to also be capable of making choices that result in evolutionary maturity and avoidance of self-extinction. One has to believe that because such a species has evolved, its very existence must be a prerequisite to something else, and that something else may well be species-driven evolution. Species-driven evolution might be an easier concept to grasp today than just a couple of years ago. Indeed, it's not only evolution that is experimenting with turning over some control to species it has evolved. Homo sapiens is turning over control to some of its own inventions, and appears to be as apprehensive as evolution is, if one can characterize evolution as being apprehensive. Passengers routinely risk their lives in airplanes flown on autopilot, and some literally did recently in 2 Boeing 737 MAX 8s. And we are getting ready to hand the steering wheel over to self-driving cars, even though some people have lost their lives there, too. Somehow the fear that these could go horribly wrong hasn't tempered our enthusiasm for pressing on. Clearly, at least some of us have concluded that the benefits outweigh the risks, just as evolution might have concluded that accepting the risk is indispensable to getting to the next phase of intelligent species evolution. So here is what might be driving this entire process. If a potential evolutionary outcome is the spread of intelligent life across the galaxy, and if the peculiar circumstances that allowed complex animal and intelligent species life to evolve on Earth is unlikely to exist on most other planets, as some scientists are beginning to suspect, then one possible way, if not the only way, to achieve that goal would be to export fully evolved and mature intelligent Earth life forms to suitable planets. And if that were true, it would make sense that evolution would be interested in evolving emergent intelligent species like Homo sapiens on Earth first, then using these to spread intelligent life to other planets. If one of these intelligent species managed to make it past self-extinction and reach evolutionary maturity, evolution would then have the means to begin populating the galaxy with mature, emergent, intelligent life, rather than starting from scratch and waiting 4 billion years all over again. A handicap, perhaps, even evolution could use. But notice the emphasis on evolutionary maturity. We defined evolutionary maturity in Chapter 6 as a survival plateau, a state that indicates an intelligent species has matured beyond the likelihood of self-extinction. Evolution appears to be uninterested in the indefinite survival of species that seem unable or unwilling to get to evolutionary maturity. The reason for this is not so hard to understand, is it? Few, if any, Homo sapiens mothers are likely to entrust the care of their human babies to an unproven robo-nanny, any more than evolution would be willing to entrust the universe to an immature species, even if intelligent. There is no point in spending 4 billion years preparing a planet to support complex animal life and evolve and groom an emergent intelligent species only to see it descend into self-extinction, potentially taking those 4 billion years of evolution with it. So it's not surprising, then, that evolution would not only limit expending resources on species that seemed unwilling or unable to evolve to maturity, but also would have a few, and one can think of at least 3, built-in fail-safes to ensure that failing species remain trapped on their home worlds, unable to migrate to the stars and spread their immaturity across the galaxy. These fail-safes are: 1. Such species will more than likely drive themselves to self-extinction. 2. Potential global climate change will drive them to extinction. And 3. Unbelievable galactic distances separate Earth from any potential Earth 2.0. Clearly, then, evolution has little interest in enabling the galactic battles imagined in Star Wars, or the ceaseless skirmishes between the Federation, the Cardassians, the Klingons, and the Vulcans of Star Trek fame. Armed with the knowledge that evolution might well be engaged in nurturing species on Earth that could become the seeds from which intelligent life is sown across the stars, the meaning of extraterrestrial evolution becomes, perhaps, less obscure. Evolution may be planning to partner with intelligent species nurtured to maturity on Earth to continue the intelligent species evolutionary process across the galaxy in a way that is perhaps not unlike the way Homo sapiens are beginning to partner with AI products. Indeed, What bees have been to flowers, Homo sapiens might well become to exoplanets. So why would evolution need to partner with an intelligent species to launch intelligent life-based extraterrestrial evolution, potentially the next phase of Homo sapiens evolution? It did quite well on its own on Earth, didn't it? Well, yes, but as noted above, while many scientists believe that microbial life might be abundant in the universe, jump-starting intelligent life on another planet or in another solar system using migrating, mature, intelligent species, such as Homo sapiens, has the potential to be much easier and faster than starting all over again from scratch on each planet. But that can hardly be the whole story, can it? To explore this question more completely, one must revisit and expand upon the concepts of evolution-inspired, species-driven evolution and species-driven innovation touched on in Chapter 5. If Homo sapiens were to avoid self-extinction, attain evolutionary maturity, and set out to migrate to other planets and solar systems, among the many issues would be how to get there. Homo sapiens probably won't have such capabilities for at least another 100 to 200 years, and getting to that level of technology might be where evolution-inspired, species-driven evolution and species-driven innovation come in. Assuming identification of a suitable Earth 2.0 capable of sustaining Homo sapiens, migration issues to be overcome are many, but two in particular pose significant challenges: interplanetary and interstellar distances, and Homo sapiens biology, sustainability, survivability, and suitability for undertaking such migrations. These areas, were they to become a species priority, would be examples of, on one hand, evolution-inspired, survival-driven innovation to attain the technologies needed for interstellar travel, and, on the other, species-driven evolution to enable potential biological enhancements that might be necessary to survive the rigors and distances of interstellar travel. But there might just be another way to migrate to the stars that one would be unwise to rule out. Homo sapiens' ability to flee out of Africa to survive did not depend upon their innovations and technologies, and if modern Homo sapiens were to attain evolutionary maturity, their ability to flee to survive might not either. Falling sea levels due to an ice age that facilitated early Homo sapiens' migration out of Africa was probably evolution's way of enabling migration when seafaring and ocean-crossing innovations and technology were multiple millennia away. One can't help wondering if that migration out of Africa would have occurred, how and when it did, or whether it would have occurred at all, but for the sea-lowering effects of that ice age, and the earlier creation of a land bridge between Africa and Arabia by plate tectonics. As noted earlier, timing was everything. One can't also help wondering if another, seemingly natural phenomenon might not serendipitously facilitate the next survival-driven, species-wide migration. This time, no doubt, an interplanetary migration, with or without the advanced technologies and innovations we think it would require. What would be the outcome if all or most of Homo sapiens' innovations and adaptations were to be directed away from profits and toward species survival and habitat sustainability? We have seen where most profit-driven innovations end up, enabling and potentially hastening the extinction of our species. Not that there haven't been outcomes that temporarily benefit our species. The problem is that many of these innovations, however marvelous, when wielded by an evolutionarily immature species, like a 4-year-old playing with a hand grenade, can end up contributing to its demise. Such were the concerns of Stephen Hawking, Elon Musk, and a few of the top techno-sapiens. And they are all sounding the alarm about AI's potential to end life as we know it. Hawking said it well when he wrote, "In the short term, AI's impact depends on who controls it. In the long term, it depends on whether it can be controlled at all." Elon Musk warns that, without oversight, AI could be an existential threat. We are summoning the demon. Bill Gates has also expressed concerns about AI. During a Q&A on Reddit in 2015, Gates said, "I am in the camp that is concerned about superintelligence. First, the machines will do a lot of jobs for us and not be superintelligent. That should be positive if we manage it well. A few decades after that, though, the intelligence is strong enough to be a concern." I agree with Elon Musk and some others on this and don't understand why some people are not concerned. Their AI fears are probably not unfounded. Evolution was daring enough to give Homo sapiens the keys to the planet, and look at what we've done to it. Now, Homo sapiens is beginning to be worried about its technological innovations becoming the source of its own extinction. Will AI choose to cooperate with Homo sapiens, or will AI choose to destroy all biological species and take the planet for its own? Given the ability to choose, would its choice be Homo sapiens survival or Homo sapiens extinction? Evolution, as we have seen, has left itself an out with its 3 ways, at least, to stop an immature species from spreading that immaturity across the stars. What would be Homo sapiens out? One can't help but notice the irony of this dilemma. AI may well be evolution's way of sharing with Homo sapiens a teachable moment. If Homo sapiens want AI to make the right choices, perhaps Homo sapiens should consider making the right choices itself. It is highly unlikely that a species that has evolved past the point of self-extinction and attained evolutionary maturity will ever devise a technology with the potential to ensure its own extinction. So, unlike many of today's futurists, I invite you, as John Lennon did, to imagine a time when Homo sapiens has reached that survival plateau. A time when the very notion of self-extinction would seem like a horror movie out of the past. Now imagine what innovations leading up to this new phase of Homo sapiens evolution might look like. One might think of it as survival-focused innovation. Wouldn't it be wonderful if today's techno-sapiens and moneyed sapiens began to prioritize, refocus, and see their innovations and investments through the lens of species survival over profits, and species extinction avoidance over personal and corporate wealth accumulation? How might our world change when the focus, motivations, drivers, and outcomes for all of Homo sapiens' innovations and investments were to transition from profits to species survival and habitat sustainability, like evolution's? How might it look when the single mantra pervading every aspect of individual, family, civic, national, and international life is not how to grow up to become an entrepreneur, CEO, big business tycoon, imam, pastor, president, dictator, terrorist, or any other goals we have defined for ourselves, but how to reach evolutionary maturity and enable our species to survive? Imagine a time when the aim of governments is not to roll back environmental laws and regulations that protect species, habitats, clean air, and clean water, like Presidents Trump and Bolsonaro, but rather how to enable species survival and habitat sustainability instead of bigger military budgets, exclusionary economic zones, and military spheres of influence, and support for states that lay waste to their own people. A time when all nations gladly open their borders to refugees and migrants, as few do today. A time when leaders seek the health, welfare, and care of their people, and put in place measures to help attain individual, community, city, state, and national evolutionary maturity. A time when the need for law enforcement, penal codes, and prisons is significantly diminished. Imagine a time when food becomes organic again, when the air and water supply are no longer being polluted, and when the oil men have pulled their rigs and frackers have dismantled their gear for the last time, and fossil fuels no longer power our economies and pollute our world. Futurists talk about a future of abundance, a time when technology will eliminate all scarcity. But it does not take a techno-sapiens to see there is no lack of abundance today, just artificial scarcity created by man-made greed. As Peter Diamandis says in his book on abundance, if one can find a way to push back the frontiers of scarcity, just look at the abundance that will become available to all. I think he envisaged technology driving this abundance. But the problem of getting to abundance was never due to a lack of technology, but rather a matter of scarcity created by greed. There was abundance before there was any man-made technology. The future of our species can never be about abundance. Evolution already gave us that. The future of our species is about survival. How different might the world be if it were no longer possible for 8 men to hoard half of an entire species' resources? How different would the world be if those 8 men, identified by Oxfam, were to distribute their billions across the half of humanity struggling on $10 a day, and in some cases less than $1.25? How different the world would be if all those offshore tax havens were emptied out, and the money repatriated to the countries and peoples to whom they probably rightfully belong. How different a world it could be, too, if all those corrupt governments, politicians, obscenely overpaid business executives, and organized crime bosses and drug traffickers could no longer be rewarded with or steal the resources of the people. How different a world it could be if all those military budgets were instead reallocated to species survival and habitat sustainability. And alas, how different a world it would be if the trillions hoarded in corporate treasuries, private investment funds, private equity firms, and by market speculators were reallocated to meet humanity's needs. And wouldn't it be wonderful to have corporations that work for all citizens, instead of just for themselves and their shareholders? Now that would be a step toward the kind of world evolution might have envisaged 4 billion years ago. That's a world one can get excited about, a world that is definitely worth investing in. That's a world worth innovating to make happen, and worth fighting for. Imagine the abundance these few changes, having little to do with innovations and technology, would release. Imagine that. How might such a future take form in your imagination? Not unlike the adventures of Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz. If you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there. It's up to each member of our species to choose. Evolution went to 4 billion years worth of effort to equip each member of our species with the freedom to choose. If we can't imagine it, we can't dream it, and if we don't dream it, we won't create it. And if we don't create this future, all we will have left is the future many envision for us now. More electronics, more technologies, bigger, better, and potentially deadlier stuff. And yes, more death, and probably, eventually, extinction. But we have a choice. Evolution made sure of that, and is counting on each of us to make the choice to attain evolutionary maturity and survive. Noam Chomsky once asked in a talk at MIT, "Is it better to be smart than to be stupid. It's worth remembering that species that have survived multiple mass extinctions, some still with us today, wouldn't be viewed by us as intelligent and never came up with anything we would recognize as innovations. Yet they survived. They survived because species survival does not depend upon species innovations, but on a species attaining evolutionary maturity. I believe Chomsky concluded that it was better to be stupid than smart. I also have a question. Is it better to be a dinosaur or a beetle? Imagine that. If from an evolutionary perspective, innovations are ultimately about getting to maturity and thereby survival, then what innovations and how should these be pursued to ensure our survival? Questions each entrepreneur, investor, consumer, and concerned entity must ask and answer in the affirmative if our species is going to survive. There is an alternate way to ask these questions, and it is: how is it that most other species, including microbes, managed to adapt and innovate for billions of years, and our hunter-gatherer forebears for millions of years, without driving to near extinction Earth's ecosystems, habitats, other species, and themselves? Let's see whether we can find out. It was Steve Jobs, at that memorable commencement address he gave in 2005 at Stanford University, who said, "You can't connect the dots looking forward. You can only connect them looking backward. So you have to trust that the dots will somehow connect in your future." And throughout this book, we have gone back to our species' past to better understand its future. When we did, we found evolutionary patterns, rules, and repeating events, such as climate change, and how these drove our forebears to adapt and innovate to survive, including migrating out of Africa. But Homo sapiens weren't the first Earth-life species to make adaptations and innovations, or embarked on migrations to survive. Indeed, early animals changed their habitat by crawling out of the oceans for the first time to live on dry land. And that led to the adoption of land as a new habitat. And we marveled at the kinds of adaptations and innovations they had to make to survive, including transitioning from fins to limbs, from gills to lungs, from seeing through water to seeing through dry air, and more. What was common to all those adaptations and innovations seen in early animals' ocean-to-land migration was that, 1, they were survival-driven, 2, enabled by biology, genetic adaptations, 3, they functioned within a common framework of chemical and biological laws in the local ecosystem, and 4, all outputs were inputs to another process. There were no waste products, no garbage. For example, early animals did not emerge from the oceans in a skin-tight water suit, the way humans must wear a diving suit or scuba gear to breathe underwater, or a spacesuit to breathe in space. They evolved lungs, and their gills were not discarded as waste. Neither did they crawl out of the oceans wearing some mechanical prosthesis. Their fins evolved into limbs. All adaptations and innovations had to interoperate and/or fit within the common framework afforded by their biology and the ecosystems within habitats. By limiting to biological changes the kinds of adaptations and innovations non-intelligent species could make, evolution ensured they stayed within that live and let live guardrail, and that, in turn, ensured coexistence and mutual survival among all species. Unlike humans, such species, then, were unlikely to come up with new, novel, and non-obvious innovations, like synthetic chemicals such as PFAS, per- and polyfluoroalkyl substances, so-called forever chemicals, or new elements that can wipe out an entire species, poison the food chain, or dump non-biodegradables like plastics and or toxic waste into the environment, but rather ensured that all mutual needs were accommodated within the local ecosystem. Homo sapiens, however, changed the evolutionary way to adapt and innovate, from biological to non-biological, from doing so inside the ecosystem to doing so outside, from ensuring the output and waste of its products became input to another, from following the live and let live survival constraints ecosystems imposed, to abandoning the ecosystem altogether and thereby its constraints. These changes not only differentiated how intelligent versus non-intelligent species adapt and innovate, but are also the reason Homo sapiens' adaptations and innovations fail while all other Earth life species succeed. What was once enabled only by genetic code or DNA changes, and may have taken generations to become standard in an emerging land animal population, became a simple knowledge transfer and or a technology upgrade for emerging intelligent species like Homo sapiens, and often in the same or succeeding generation. Not that there was something wrong with this change from genes to memes, but it has resulted in several orders of magnitude increase in the human innovation adoption rate, a pace so frenzied that it threatens our ability to keep up. Hence, with enhanced abilities came the need to attain evolutionary maturity, to safeguard against inadvertently adapting and innovating in ways that result in extermination of species, habitats, and potentially ourselves, a path down which we seem well on the way. However, while the rate and the how of innovation changed from non-intelligent to intelligent species, the why of innovation, survival, did not. The pace and method changed from genes to memes, from biological to non-biological, and from instinct-driven to freedom to choose one's own evolutionary outcome. But survival, the evolutionary reason to adapt and innovate, did not. In other words, for any Earth life species to succeed, its adaptations and innovations must be survival-driven. Survival remains the only evolutionary given motivation to adapt and innovate. And it has been our ability to change the motivation, the reason to adapt and innovate, from survival to profits, greed, growth, and gain, that makes modern Homo sapiens adaptations and innovations so different from that of all other Earth life species, and that has led to the risks and threats these now pose to our survival. Whereas all species, including our hunter-gatherer forebears, for millions of years adapted and innovated to survive, and did so within Earth's ecosystems, early humans abandoned them when we transitioned to agriculture. In addition, we abandoned the need to ensure that waste from our products became inputs to subsequent products. We also stepped beyond that evolutionary live and let live reason to adapt and innovate, and its intended outcome, survival, and chose instead to do so for personal gain, profit, economic growth, and the pursuit of science and innovation. And, moreover, we did so at the risk and often at the expense of ecosystems, habitats, and species survival, including our own. Well, not exactly, as the millions of Homo sapiens who, as African slaves, bore so much of this early scientific research cost wouldn't have been regarded by those scientists and innovators as our own. Indeed, so anxious and driven we were to adapt and innovate that not even the enslavement and death of more than 12 million African humans, taken from their homes between the 15th and 19th centuries, were allowed to get in the way of scientific and economic progress. In a sciencemag.org article published April 4, 2019, Sam Keene claimed that scientific research not only depended on colonial slavery, but enabled it and helped expand its reach. He wrote, "To gain access to Africa and the Americas, scientists hitched rides on slave ships on which men and women were chained for weeks in hot, filthy holds, where diseases ran rampant and punishment for disobedience was harsh. Upon arrival, naturalists also relied on slavers for food, shelter, mail, equipment, and local transport. Indeed, major U.S. universities such as Yale, Georgetown, and Brown have acknowledged how they benefited from slavery, while others are just coming to grips with the link between early science and slavery and the role their institutions might have played. It was slave labor that built the first major observatory in the Southern Hemisphere, in Cape Town, South Africa. Astronomers such as Edmund Halley solicited observations of the moon and stars from slave ports, and geologists collected rocks and minerals there. Even a field as rarefied as celestial mechanics benefited from slavery. Modern science and the transatlantic slave trade were two of the most important factors in the shaping of the modern world, and historians are finally recognizing that they shaped each other as well. And it was not just scientific research that had its foundations laid in the blood of African slaves and slaves of numerous peoples, but most of the modern civilizations Homo sapiens has built. According to History.com, since the beginning of civilization, post-hunter-gatherers, slavery has played a huge role in society, from the building of the pyramids in Egypt to indentured servitude in England. In fact, at the turn of the 19th century, an estimated 3/4 of the world was trapped in bondage against their will, some form of slavery or serfdom. But at what cost? What has been the outcome of ignoring evolution's live and let live, survival-driven reason to adapt and innovate? The consequences we now see are imminent, numerous, extreme, and dire. Extreme heat, extreme weather events, sea level rise, glacier retreat, accelerating water shortages and droughts, ocean acidification and marine life die-off, ecosystem disruptions, numerous extinctions, and even worse, a seeming accelerating collapse of the natural world. In less than 200 years, our species has managed to adapt and innovate its way to the edge of a self-extinction precipice, and, potentially, can end up taking with it 4 billion years of evolution as well. It is not the planet our innovations have put at risk. Earth has survived numerous extinctions. Nor is it the dinosaurs. Unlike megafauna that came later, they at least never had to deal with us. But it's us, humans, the wise ones, Homo sapiens, the ones with the freedom to choose survival over extinction, evolution's last surviving Earth-based intelligent species. Chapter 10, Innovation, Continued. To answer the how part of the above question, then, how Homo sapiens should adapt and innovate. Clearly, we should do so in such a way as to ensure habitat and species, including Homo sapiens, survival. If we can see our way clear to do that, the what part of the question becomes obvious. We must only adapt and innovate the kinds of solutions that enhance and ensure the chances for survival. In the end, we would find that doing so would have been the best long-term return on our species' investments, our survival. In view of the above, what innovations should be focused on immediately and in the short, intermediate, and long term? If one were to build an Innovations for Survival dashboard to lend focus and track progress, as well as suggest areas for inventors, innovators, entrepreneurs, humanitarians, philanthropists, and anyone else concerned about our species' survival to concentrate their efforts on, what would be the top 10 one might want to begin with? And how would one classify them from immediate to long term? Here are some to consider, along with a rating assignment. Homo sapiens, the number one threat to its own survival. Rating, a historic, immediate, present, and dangerous near-term and long-term threat to survival. Homo sapiens has been, is, and will always be the biggest threat to its own survival until it attains evolutionary maturity. There are no aliens attacking the Earth. We are the source and creator of everything that now threatens our very survival. These so-called threats are the symptoms of the real issue that evolution wants us to recognize and deal with before it's too late. None would exist if we could focus and solve this mother of all threats. But be warned, you won't find this threat on any government or corporate research agenda. Nor will you find any VCs or venture capitalists looking to fund, or startups wanting to innovate a solution to this problem. And while philanthropists and their foundations pour billions into treating symptoms, like healthcare and education, none seem able to recognize that we are the root cause of all the problems they are trying to solve. There probably isn't time left to kick this can of threats further down the road yet again. Today, pandemics, nuclear missiles, WMDs, cyber warfare, CO2-driven climate change, rising ocean temperatures, a growing water shortage and drought in many regions, and AI are among the top threats on any list. Yesterday, it was knives, pickaxes, swords, javelins, arrows, and bows and spears. Tomorrow, it will be even worse nightmares. Yet we can't even identify ourselves as the root cause of all these woes. Like an ostrich, we bury our heads in the sand. We choose to treat the symptoms rather than the cause. Is it really so hard? As a species, we are not even trying to address this most existential of threats. We can't, won't, or maybe don't even see ourselves in this way, or name ourselves as the threat we pose to ourselves. It's not the Russians, the Chinese, the North Koreans, the Americans, or the Indians. It's us. Don't you remember? Homo sapiens. It's not the East, the West, the North, or the South. It's not communism, democracy, fascism, or capitalism. Nor is it Christianity, Islam, or Buddhism. We are not Africans, Americans, British, Canadians, Chinese, Europeans, Indians, Japanese, Israelis, Russians, Turks, Egyptians, Syrians, Taiwanese, or any